But this paper follows a request. Came out of the blue. I was contacted by somebody asking if I would do a short paper for a handbook that's going to go online for Oxford University Press on burial and industrial archaeology. And I thought this was quite an interesting thing. I'd not really thought about industrial archaeology at all. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historian. And so I thought this was quite an interesting sort of proposal. And I was very excited about doing it. And what I'm going to talk to you today is kind of pretty much what I thought. I must warn you as well, they asked me to be a little bit provocative. They said, be provocative. So I did. And we'll see whether you agree with me or not, considering what I'm about to say. So this combination of burial and industrial archaeology is perhaps more unusual than you might think, but it does give us tremendous scope to expand the burial research agenda. So I'm coming to this question as a historian, but my central interest in burial space, I've got a number, but one of the central interests that I have for burial space is to ask the very, very simple question, what happens when a community decides that it needs burial space? What happens? What happens then? What happens after that? And actually that question just happens over time, over space, in every circumstance. So it's a very interesting question to sort of start with, a very simple question. One area that I've been looking at, obviously, in quite a lot of detail, but which has expanded really out since then, is looking at, particularly in the 19th century, and the ways in which settlements found that the decisions they were making about burial space were getting to be quite hard to make, given new scientific understandings of burial space, in particular in the framework of also a desire to protect the interests of the Church of England. So we had quite a lot of tension in the 19th century, and it's one of the areas where I've done a lot of work. The subject of burials benefits greatly from multiple contributions, I think, from industrial archaeology. And there are three contributions that I want to talk about today. They are appropriate research methods, theoretical considerations, and conservation expertise. In fact, I think that in creating a kind of dialogue between industrial archaeology and the whole issue of burial frames new questions for both of those things. So it gives us a whole set of new questions when we think about burial, and also I think it helps us think a little bit too about industrial archaeology, so I find it interesting on both fronts. And here, one of the things that I want to discuss a little bit is the whole concept of working knowledge as a key component, I think, that's been lacking in our understanding of burial space, particularly in an urban context. So the first thing I want to talk about is appropriate research methods. When you look at industrial archaeology, what kind of research methods are they telling us about that's useful for burial? I think it's worth stating that we've got a tendency not to view the burial landscape as a particularly dynamic element of the urban environment. Although historical archaeology, I think, has begun to explore some of those things. There's a lot of really good historical archaeology that's coming through that's beginning to see burial in a wider sort of urban context. But I think there's a great deal to be said about mapping patterns of provision so we can be clearer about the chronologies of burial site usage and ownership in the urban landscape, and about changes in land use within each site. I think we need to create narratives that answer some really very basic questions at the heart, that sit at the heart of industrial archaeology. And the questions are really kind of very basic, like, why is this factory here? Why is it here and not over there? I think it's a really basic question, very interesting question, but we tend not to ask it when we're thinking about burial space. And also, how did that develop over time? It was established, and then what happened? What happened to that space? This is another question I think we need to think about a little bit more. And I think what we tend not to appreciate is that we have a very, very complicated narrative when it comes to understanding shifting usage of different types of burial space. In particular, we tend to get stuck with a kind of dichotomic, we have churchyards and then we have cemeteries. We shift from one to the other. You know, there's a whole sort of like Foucauldian thing going on there about the way in which we understand burial in modernity. But actually what I've come to realise in the past couple of years in doing an awful lot more research that looks at cemeteries and churchyards together, which tends not to be done, I think we have a much, much, much more complicated kind of situation. This and I'm really apologetic because this is about England, but I think this is a kind of an approach you can sort of apply pretty much anywhere that you're talking about. But in England, I think there are 5 key phases that we need to sort of think about. First, understanding a kind of pre-industrial sort of situation. We're talking about a large majority, a big monopoly held by the Church of England. Parishes are the basic church administration unit in England. I'm not sure about how that works in Ireland. I don't know if the parish is the basic administration unit in Ireland, but is that the case still? It's gone, but it used to be. Yeah, very much so in England then. So the parish was the basic church administration unit, but it could contain 1 or more settlements and 1 or more burial spaces. We've heard such a lot about corpse paths today, and a lot of that is about moving people from one settlement to the other. Parishioners had the right to burial in their own parish burial space. There was an expectation that the Church of England would provide graveyard space, so everyone was looking to the Church of England to do this job. It's the parish unit that sits underneath and defines all the later patterns of burial provision. So you've really got to get your head around the parish as an administrative unit. The second phase emerges kind of in the 18th century. Old Descent had already begun to establish new burial spaces. That's chapel grounds attached to Baptist chapels, Presbyterians, Quakers. But New Descent, principally Methodists, had already begun to provide burial space around chapels as well, certainly by the end of the 18th century. Bigger towns had started to acquire new churchyards in addition to their very old ancient churchyards. And in addition to that, very big places like London, had also begun to acquire kind of commercial burial chapels, very small chapels that might just sell burial in the vaults as a commercial enterprise. And they were very much coming up in London. Some sites sit on the edge of that. You know, they say, well, this is a Baptist chapel, but actually they're making quite a lot of money from vault burial beneath them. So some are sort of but very small scale. The third phase, a major expansion in the first half of the 19th century, and I think there's 2 big developments I want to talk about. I could talk about lots more, but 2 big ones. First, something that we're all probably quite familiar with, large-scale investment in burial space by the nonconformist community using joint stock finance. That's one big thing to think about, which we all know about when we think about joint stock cemeteries. But the other thing that tends to be overlooked and is missing from the general narrative we have of burial is the massive, massive expansion of churchyard space that happened in the first half of the 19th century. The Church Building Act was also called the Million Act because it dedicated £1 million to new church buildings. And all of those new churches bought new burial space. And the interesting thing about that as well was, under those regulations, you couldn't bury in the church, you had to bury in the churchyard. So we got a new understanding, really, of what that churchyard space was about. And in my view, the amount of churchyard space that was created in the first half of the 19th century was massively bigger than new cemetery space that was established at that time, which again makes us start to question this whole notion of secularity in the 19th century. The fourth phase was the passage of the Burial Acts at the mid-19th century, which substantially expanded the amount of consecrated burial space that was available, because what the Burial Act sat on top of was the old parish provision. What the Burial Act said was all the new Burial Act cemeteries were essentially an extension of the parish burial ground in their consecrated sections, but they also had unconsecrated sections for nonconformist burial space as well. So both sort of sets of denominations benefited, but the church certainly didn't disbenefit from this particular development. So we had the Burial Acts expanding that space, and also still, as you go through the second half of the 19th century, massive attention, massive investment in churchyard extensions. There's a new act that comes out in 1867, Churchyard Extension Act, which makes that a lot easier, massively extends the amount of churchyard space in new churchyard extensions. And then finally, only really as we get into the 20th century, do we get the growth of cemeteries and crematoria. Obviously, we have some very early examples, but they really sort of start to get underway pretty much really from the interwar period. So what we're talking about is a really complicated network of provision that gets more complicated as life goes on. And I'm working with a landscape person in Sheffield, and we produced this, it didn't come out very well, this kind of 3D map. So at the bottom, this is 1815, and we're going up to the 20th century. Sheffield, this is the boundary of Sheffield. It has a number, That's the parish of Sheffield. It has these sort of settlements within it. And as you go through, by the time you get to 1900, you see all the arrows still in play. These are all the different kinds of burial space still in play. Very many of those Church of England burial sites that are extensions to existing churchyards. So a very, very complicated picture at 1900, much more complicated than you might imagine. So actually, the whole notion of these approaches that industrial archaeology takes to developments in urban burial space are really quite essential to our understanding of mapping burial provision. They're a very, very good kind of way of thinking about how to understand that shift in burial provision. So it makes us ask really basic questions. Why is the burial space located where it is? It's a really simple question. And it becomes more problematic as we talk about these urban spaces, because it's more complicated. You can't just simply extend the existing churchyard. You've got to think about where within these settlements you're going to locate new burial space, particularly given new scientific understandings of proximity to existing places of residence, impact on the water supply, access to and from the site, and really important things about the kind of soil that's being looked at and whether its drainage is suitable for rapid decomposition. So the really, really important things that begin to come into play with that decision. The other thing is that this patchwork actually makes us think that we've got to be much, much more accurate about our definitions of what we're talking about. At the end, when we've got all these arrows saying we've got all of this new provision, we've got to be quite careful about what it is we're talking about. So it's not just a cemetery. Is it really a cemetery, or is it a detached churchyard extension? Because these are different sets of regulations that are really coming into play here. And also, to be really tedious about it, because I'm really nerdish about cemeteries, is it a burial board cemetery, or is it cemeteries established under the new Public Health Act? Because both of those had different religious political connotations for the town involved, considering the amount of that land that would be consecrated. So actually thinking quite hard about what it is we're talking about. You know, we've seen lots and lots of pictures of memorials, but I always want to know, where is it? What is it in? Who owns it? What type of site are we talking about? And then I can think, perhaps then I can understand what kind of memorial we're looking at. So those things, I think, for me are quite important. So then, as you can appreciate, the internal usage of the site also becomes very important. I think there's a tendency to focus, for example, on class difference within cemeteries, but actually the use of burial space more generally can tell us a great deal, for example, about attitudes towards children and where children were buried in any site that you're looking at, and about relationships between different religious denominations, and about kinship identity, another thing I think that's quite important, and about attitudes towards the dead body, how much space is afforded the dead body. And all of those things, when you look at the site, might not be visually available because a lot of the monuments have been cleared or moved away, but certainly they will be there often in the historic record. Certainly, given the amount of work that's been done on Mount Lawrence, that's really great questions that we can ask about the Mount Lawrence Cemetery. So to move to think about more theoretical concerns. So that was thinking about kind of research methods, research questions. Thinking more theoretically. Industrial archaeology, and I'll quote here, illuminates the context of people working in the past. And that generally gives us two threads of inquiry. That is, material evidence relating to labour practices, and that's all gotten to be very Marxist about sort of capitalism and labour practices. But the second thing, which has been trying to understand the ways in which the Industrial Revolution was a kind of heroic scientific exercise. So we can look at industrial artifacts and celebrate our industrial culture. So those are the two threads within that. But I think there's a third thread that appeals to me at the moment, and that's the notion of working knowledge. I think working knowledge is a quite interesting thing to think about. We all know what it is to have a working knowledge of something. You know, you're in a room, you're in a car, you can know how it works because you do it all the time. And I think working knowledge is a really interesting way of thinking about how people were in cemeteries, how people were in burial grounds, different kinds of burial space. Because they were working in it, they were actually using it. And I think working processes on top of that are also subject to what we might call operational evolution. So you begin to use something and then you shift it a bit. You think, well, actually, it'd be easier if I did it that way. We get sets of regulations that come through from the burial offices, but actually there's an awful lot of discretion about how people can use those regulations. And that's what I call kind of operational evolution. People begin to do things their own way because the soil particularly not great in that area. We're going to use the shoring a bit differently in that area because actually it's a bit soggy over there. These are the kinds of operational things that start to come in when people think about how to manage their cemeteries and burial spaces. So, sorry, turning over. And I think that, again, invites us to make a distinction between theoretical principles and actually what happens on the ground. Because it's very easy to read sort of manuals or regulations or acts of parliament, but actually what did people do within a cemetery or a burial ground when they actually had to bury people there? What was going on? So I think it'd be useful to begin to recapture the working knowledge within the cemetery. Cemeteries I'm particularly interested in, so that's what I'll talk about just now. The cemetery is almost never regarded as a place of work, where the evolution of particular skill sets will have an impact on the landscape. And I think there's 3 individuals that are particularly important in this one. First, there's a cemetery manager. This is a new individual. The cemetery clerk that kind of evolves from the 19th century becomes key to the implementation of the Burial Acts and also makes an awful lot of the decisions about how to interpret the regulation that comes through. Cemetery managers begin to emerge as a profession, certainly by the end of the 19th century, and into the 20th century begin to define the cemetery landscape. It's their professional task to define what that landscape looks like. And it's cemetery managers who are doing this. They spend all their time writing to each other, talking to each other about how they're dealing with particular issues. So these professions are really framing what this landscape looks like. So cemetery managers are really good to think about. The second kind of people that we tend not to think about are grave diggers, sextons, the people who are actually digging the grave. I've not dug a grave. I know a lot of people who have. It's quite skilled work. It's not very easy. In the 19th century, when people were digging common graves, they were very, very deep. It was very skilled labour. And it's actually quite easy to overlook the fact that actually as time went on, particularly as health and safety requirements started to come in, then new products began to be developed to support that kind of work. It's quite interesting. I love these guys in these suits. I'm being very polite here, I'm just jigging this thing. But these kinds of developments in different kinds of industrial machines to help people manage the landscape, the development of little diggers that can go between graves, all of these things, I think, are parts of the industrial working of burial space that we tend not to think about, but have an impact on the way that cemeteries look, particularly the obsessions that come in with lawn. Lawn is a big obsession with cemetery managers in thinking about trimming lawn and doing all of that kind of thing. So that's the second thing. Have I got another thing? Oh, yes, this is the kinds of products that are available to cemetery managers. This is something, again, that we don't think about. Occasionally, you might come across these bits and pieces lying about that help cemetery managers just find, they're plotting out the site. These are kind of the infrastructure, the administration infrastructure that we still might see on site. Third, stonemasons. I mean, we've talked an awful lot about memorial masonry today, but not really very much about the industry of stonemasonry, and not at all about what happens under the ground. I mean, I'm desperate to see inside some vaults. The complexity of these constructs under the ground must be phenomenal. When you think you have this huge memorial on top, but somehow you have to get inside, underneath, and deal with something under the ground. You hear stories from cemetery managers telling you about, well, you get down the steps, it's a bit spooky, you don't want the door to go, and you're thinking, well, what did it look like? What happened under the ground? How did masons design these vaults? Because when you look at them, the access isn't always necessarily straightforward. How did they design? Did they keep secrets about how to do it? Because it was commercially, we found a good way of doing it, but we're not telling anybody else because our way is quite good. How did all that work? How did masons tell each other about how to design these things? I think it's important. I'm going to get one more minute. Look, half a thing. So, new sets of questions. So finally, I think I'm just going to couple of minutes about conservation imperatives. And again, I think here's an area where there's an awful lot of fruitful dialogue between industrial archaeology and burial space. I think there are tensions around the need to protect our industrial heritage, and these are the same tensions that sit within our need to protect the burial landscape. The big question is, what is it we're trying to save? Oh, goodness me, it's gone. What is it we're trying to save? I think that in England, certainly, the Cemetery Friends groups, when they first were established by people who were very concerned with protecting the Victorian aspects of our burial heritage. They came up in the early 1980s when there was a great deal of cultural interest in the Victorian period, after a long time in which the Victorian period was not particularly highly regarded. So we had a real concern, I think, not necessarily to protect our cemeteries, but to protect our Victorian cemeteries. And we'd begun to sort of overlook what was important, really, about our cemetery landscape. I wanted to show you this picture, this final picture at the bottom. So, I'll explain this picture in a minute. So I want to ask, has our conservation effort been directed towards protecting the idealised image of the Victorian cemetery landscape? I think that's very much the case. It's kind of a theme park with a morbid kind of edge. I don't know about you, but night tours of cemeteries are starting to become popular. I've seen that there are vampire parties that you can have in cemeteries where you can carve your own headstone. All of that, you think, I'm a little dismayed by, because it's not really treating this space with the academic seriousness I'd like it to be treated with, to be honest, because I get a bit huffy about that kind of thing. But if you're talking about Victorian cemeteries and you're really interested in Victorian cemeteries, this is a typical Victorian cemetery. This is kind of what if you're really interested in Victorians, this is the kind of thing that it looked like. And it looks very different, I think, to this notion of angels within ivy and it all being quite blissfully sort of melancholy. So I think we've got to think about what it is that we're trying to protect and how to understand what it is that we're trying to protect as a really big question. So to conclude, I think we do need lots of questions. There have been lots of questions today so we can better understand our very similar and very strikingly different burial cultures across the UK and across Europe. Engagement with the core preoccupations of industrial archaeology, I think, offers us substantial potential to help us recapture the working knowledge of cemeteries. Thank you.